A partially favorable allowance means that the DDS found you disabled and you're going to get a monthly check, but your pocketbook is going to be a little lighter because you may not be getting as much back pay or no back pay at all. If you have a pending claim at the DDS, I bet you're hoping for that good news that you've been approved or really allowed by the DDS for SSDI benefits. But there's something you need to know about allowances. There are basically two types of them, but no matter which one you get, they're both based on the same thing, and that is an onset date. But there are different kinds of onset dates. There's the alleged onset date, or AOD, which is the one that you claim when you got disabled the first time. There's also the POD, which is a potential onset date, which is what the field office says was the first time you were disabled. There are administrative onsets, exact medical onsets, amended onsets, but the one you need to remember is the EOD, which is the established onset date. This is the date that the DDS determines when you were first disabled, when you first met their definition of disability. Everything related to your future allowance/approval rotates and revolves around that EOD. Every allowance has an EOD. There are basically two types of allowances based on two different types of EODs. Those two types of allowances are a fully favorable allowance and a partially favorable allowance, or also called a less than fully favorable allowance. Let's get into the fully favorable allowance right now. Now, a fully favorable allowance is based on a fully favorable established onset date. What that looks like is this. When the AOD, the date that you decided you were disabled, and the EOD, which is the date that the DDS decided, match, when they actually end up being the same date, then you have a fully favorable onset, which will result in a fully favorable allowance. And when they hand down that determination, your benefits will be effective as of that EOD, which is the same date as your AOD. Make sense? So if there is back pay you're entitled to, then that will stretch all the way back to that EOD. And there's a chance, based on your situation, that you may get that full 12 months of back pay, which is the maximum that SSA will give you. Now, sometimes the EOD is earlier than the date that you gave the AOD. Sometimes that does happen. In other words, the DDS said that you were disabled way before the time that you said you were disabled, but that really doesn't matter because all they're going to do is set the EOD as your AOD. One thing you need to be aware of is this. The DDS will stop development when they have enough evidence to find you fully favorable for an allowance. In other words, when you meet the medical or the medical and vocational criteria for disability, they will stop development on your case and they will give you that fully favorable EOD. Now let's get into what a partially favorable allowance is. A partially favorable allowance means that the DDS found you disabled and you're going to get a monthly check, but your pocketbook is going to be a little lighter because you may not be getting as much back pay or no back pay at all. A partially favorable allowance is when your AOD, the date that you chose, is earlier than the established onset date that the DDS sets. A partially favorable onset means that you chose an AOD when you thought you were disabled, but the DDS said that you were disabled later, sometime later than your AOD. So your EOD is on a later date than the AOD, which is the date that you chose. If you said you were disabled on January 1st, 2020, but the DDS didn't see you as being disabled until a year later, well, that means that you will be an allowance, but you will only get a partially favorable onset. So the EOD and the AOD don't match. And when that happens, the EOD is going to be the date that is going to be the onset date, and it's going to be a less than fully favorable allowance. Now, there are numerous reasons why there is a less than fully favorable onset. It could be something on the medical side. It could be something on a technical side, or it could be something on the medvoc or medical vocational side. One good example is when there is what's called a borderline age situation. You might fall between two age categories on the medvoc grid. The younger age category may direct a decision of not disabled before the EOD, but after the EOD, the older age category may direct a decision of disabled. So the DDS would give you a partially favorable allowance from the EOD going forward because they found that you were not disabled before that EOD. Details on borderline age in another video. When you have a partially favorable allowance, the DDS should be mailing you a notice explaining the change in the onset date. And the notice will also explain why it was changed. This is highly important, and here's the reason why. You can actually appeal the onset date. So let's say that you were allowed, approved, whatever you want to call it, and your EOD is later than your alleged onset date. If you don't agree with that, you can actually file a recon and say, hey, you said I was disabled then, but I was really disabled way before then. So I'm going to appeal the decision on recon and then change the onset back to the AOD or sometime before this EOD. So you agree with the decision because you want to get that check, but you don't agree with the onset date, which means maybe some more back pay or back pay to begin with. Now, in some rare cases, what could happen is this. When you appeal your onset date and you file your recon, the DDS upon further inspection can actually see that, oh, we allow this person, and this person should be a denial. And they could deny you, even though you were allowed at the initial. They might come back and see something that was done or not done and make the decision that you should actually be a denial, even though you were only appealing the change in onset. It's very rare, but it can happen. But usually this is not the case. In most cases, you meet the definition of disability and you shouldn't have any issues trying to appeal that change of onset. So I had to let you know, so at least you know that that possibility is there. You don't get blindsided later on. Now let's talk about a different kind of EOD, and that's called an interim EOD. Check this out. Let's say that the DDS makes a decision and they're aware that you could actually be in line for an earlier EOD. So what they will do is decide that, yes, the evidence does show that you meet the conditions and the criteria for disability, and we can push that decision through and say, okay, you are allowed. But what they'll do is say, hey, field office, why don't you send this case back to us once you do your homework, and then we'll go back through the case again to see if we can give him the earlier onset. It works to your advantage to give you the decision that says you are an allowance. Maybe it's partially favorable, but it's still an allowance. They make the decision, they send the case to the field office, and then they tell the field office, send the case back to us after you put this person in pay, after you start getting these checks moving and get things set up to get the checks to them. Send the case back to us, and then we'll work on the case some more to get an earlier onset, which could mean more back pay. So essentially, the DDS is telling the field office three things. The first thing is there's a potential or possible earlier onset. The second thing is they recommend that they start paying benefits, they effectuate your benefits. The third thing is once they effectuate payment for you to send the case back, for them to decide if there's an earlier onset date possible. Onset dates for fully favorable allowances and partially favorable allowances are basically money in the bank to a certain degree, but keep in mind that you have to be aware of the established onset date. It's always helpful to know what that is because a lot of things revolve around that EOD. Now, if you're stuck on me calling this an allowance and not an approval because it's confusing you, get over it. What I'm trying to do is help you to understand SSA's language. And if you really want to know what SSA's language is, I got the glossary in this video that I'm about to tell you right now. And that video is right up here. All you need to do is click on this video and it'll take you straight to the video. And I'll see you on the other side in that next video.